I grew up completely off the grid. When I was about 16, the first solar subsidies in this country helped bring electricity to our family home for the first time. And that was really one of the first things that sort of sparked this curiosity in the renewables transition or transformation. We should be thinking about households in Australia as solar panels being on the roof, being about as standard as having smoke alarms inside your home. It really doesn't make any sense in a country that's just so profoundly blessed with solar. One opportunity to get this right as a country. If I look around the state of the Australian national debate, there really isn't an alternative on offer. We're not talking about Australia becoming a professional services hub by the middle of the century. We're not talking about Australia exporting something else. We're not talking about us making oodles more money than we used to make, for example, through foreign students and education. There's just not a source of prosperity which will replace on our trade balance sheet coal and LNG. So we either really dive into this agenda and get it right and start building it now, or we don't. If we're being proactive about it, my point is merely that we need to also be thinking about.
Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're recording and on which you're listening today, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome back to Before It Scales. I'm Joy, and my co-host today is Fraser Thompson, sitting in the room with me. Today we have the opportunity to talk to Thom Woodroofe, whose new book is helping us step back and reflect on whether we're talking about the transition in a way that resonates with most Australians and includes everyone in the benefits. Thom is a climate diplomat turned policy strategist. He helped secure the Paris Agreement, advised former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in Washington, built the Asia Society's China Climate Hub, and has worked at the intersection of international climate negotiations and Australian politics for most of his career. He's now a senior international fellow at the Smart Energy Council, where he's focused on green metals diplomacy and COP31, and he is a senior advisor at Kaya Partners. And he's just published a book called Power, Prosperity and Planet, Climate and Energy Policy for All, which we're going to talk about today, along with some of the policy ideas that could help expand the benefits of the transition to more Australians. So, Thom, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great fun to be here.
So, Thom, as I mentioned in the intro, you've spent 15 years in the halls of international climate diplomacy overseas and at home. Tell us a bit more about your story and what prompted the writing of this book.
So I grew up a slightly interesting existence in country Victoria, which is I grew up completely off the grid, which was pretty unusual for someone of my age. But when I was about 16, the first solar subsidies in this country helped bring regular electricity to our family home for the first time. And that was really one of the first things that sort of sparked this curiosity in the renewables transition or transformation across this country. And I was really lucky a number of years later, after studying at university and all the rest of it, to spend about a decade in the UN climate negotiations, in fact advising the president of the Marshall Islands, which is one of the lowest lying atoll nations in the world, but who went on to play a really, really significant role in the Paris Agreement process, including because they corralled the progressive forces. And then went off and did a whole bunch of other things, some of which you just mentioned in your introduction, including working with China and working with former Prime Minister Rudd as his chief of staff and so forth. But as I've come back to Australia more and more over the last few years, and we've just moved back as a family, it's really struck me that as a country, there's a number of parts of this transition that we really need to make sure that we get right if we're going to be able to bring everyone with us. And frankly, if we're not going to leave people behind, and we already are leaving people behind, I think particularly of a lot of renters in this country who don't benefit from the same sort of benefits and incentives for renewable energy that people that own their own home do. I think a lot about people in regional areas like I grew up, where large-scale infrastructure is in place, but they are not necessarily benefiting from that themselves. I think about people in industrial towns, who I'm sure we'll speak about today, who are really at risk of missing out as part of this transition. So we've got to get some of these fundamental settings right. But I think too often people like me, and I really do mean people like me because I think I'm the worst offender of this, too often we kind of preach from on high about this transition. We talk about Paris Agreement, we talk about net zero, we talk about the imperatives for this transition rather than actually why it just makes inherent economic sense, not off into the future, but here and now for particularly middle Australia, which is, I think, the heart of us ensuring that we get this right. So what I wanted to do was, in the book, sort of trace the three big transitions as I see it. So one is to our renewable energy system, so power. One is to our sources of economic wealth, so the prosperity point. And one is to look at our national resilience, including in terms of things like bushfire risk and all the rest of it, and think about how, if you are in a middle class household in Australia, how can we better frame these transitions to you? But more importantly, how can we build actual policy that speaks to you here and now? And that's what the little book tries to do.
And you argue that the climate movement has won the argument on the science, but hasn't built that political coalition to sustain the transition. Could you talk us a bit more through that thesis?
Yeah, again, I think we also really often start with the science, which is not necessarily the best place to start. It really struck me in preparing to write the book. I tried to read sort of everything that I thought was relevant that existed in the Australian literature on the topic over the last sort of decade or so. And almost every one of those books begins with the science, which is fine. But if you're trying to have an inclusive conversation, often starting with the science is not the best place to begin. And actually what I wanted to do was kind of write a book that, irrespective of whether you believe the climate is changing, so whether you believe in the science or not, irrespective of whether you think that renewables are a vast global conspiracy or they're not, whether you think the world's flat or whether you think the world's round, I don't care. What I wanted to speak to was what are these transitions and how they can look like here and now. So I think we've got to be able to meet people where they are is the fundamental premise of the book. And if we can get that right, then good policy making will flow from it.
And you make the point that every major energy transition was driven by self-interest, from animal power to steam to diesel. And people only adopted these new technologies because they were cheaper or faster or more convenient. So is the clean energy transition any different? Is that kind of where you're going with that?
In part, that quote, it's a great quote. It's an Alan Finkel quote, in fact, not one from me. But I think he absolutely nailed the point, which is often when a transition will happen naturally when you get the fundamental settings right? You shouldn't have to necessarily force it. Now, I think that at the moment, we don't live in an equal playing field when it comes to this transition. We've got a lot of, for example, fossil fuel subsidies, when we don't have the same kind of subsidies for particularly a lot of the new industries, which I know both of you are very passionate about. So we don't exist on a level playing field. But if we can get those fundamental policy shifts right, if we can make it make sense at a household level, if we can do the macro stuff right, for example, with things like Future Made in Australia, then it will help that transition in its natural direction. The other point, though, I'd make is that, things have changed a lot in the last decade, and things have changed a lot in the decade before that. People in the sort of world that I have come from often look at this transition through the perspective of where things stood at different international negotiating moments. And if you think about just the profound difference between, say, the ill-fated Copenhagen period of 2009 versus the Paris period of 2015, the economics had vastly shifted, not least the cost of solar power, which in many ways my own personal journey had borne out somewhat. But if you look again between the period of Paris, where we had this profound moment of global unity in support of this transition, to now, again, the economics have profoundly shifted again. So much so that, actually, to your earlier question, when we were agreeing that Paris Agreement, it was largely through the prism of the science is clear, the economic trend is clear. Whereas now, if you are looking at things from purely an investment decision over even a short-term horizon, it's hard to see how anything other than the economics are not compelling here and now in the macros. So there have been some really big shifts in this transition already in a short space of time.
So let's shift to some of those policy ideas and the benefits that could reach more Australians. So for many, especially renters and people in apartments, rooftop solar, for example, and batteries feel like something that's for other people. What do you think needs to change, and which policies could be used to expand those benefits of renewables to more households?
Yeah, so look, solar power, I think, is a great example of this, right? And I think that we often beat our chests and think that we have done so well with solar. And in a way we have, right? We've got 4 million Australian households with rooftop solar. We've got 10 million Australians going to sleep each night under the power of the sun. We've got the largest penetration of the technology anywhere in the world. We've got an enormous rebate program right now if you want to install a battery, which 400,000 Australian households have taken up in like 10 months of it operating. By the way, about a third of those have installed a battery, have installed solar for the first time. And a lot of them, because they've installed a bloody great battery, have also upgraded the existing solar panels because the battery is they're not going to benefit as much from their battery if they don't. That said, all of that is people who own their own homes, right? And the way that our taxation system is geared, the way that our financial system is geared, and the way that these incentives have been geared have been all about supporting those folks and not people who are renting or, as you also point out, who live in apartments. So a couple of ideas that I point to in the book. One is, for example, we could have things like stamp duty discounts in this country if if an owner was to install solar on their property. We could look at green mortgages through our financial institutions. Part of the reason, in fact, that would make economic sense, by the way, is that if you have solar on your roof and your energy bills are lower or completely gone, if you have a battery as well, then obviously your default risk on a home loan is actually lower. So there's a reason to do that. Dare I talk about negative gearing? But if, for example, at the moment you do own an investment property and you want to put solar on that roof for whatever reason, even if it doesn't necessarily incentivize your own hip pocket, it's a 20-year depreciation schedule for those solar panels. We could cut that dramatically. We could have it as an instant write-off, for example, and that would help incentivize more and more of the housing stock to actually have these solar panels. It's also done, by the way, through the prism of, often the people that are struggling the most with the cost of living, not exclusively so, but often a lot of people are in fact renting. And also that they are doing everything within their own agency to reduce their energy bills, right? And a lot of us know people, or certainly have heard about people who are doing dramatic steps like, cuddling up in bed at night rather than having the heaters on when they watch TV. Or, only heating certain rooms of their house or whatever it may be. But they are doing everything that they possibly can. But the big thing that they can't do is control the source of their electricity. And that, in my view, shouldn't rely on whether you've got savings, whether you've got a sympathetic landlord, whether you're a good negotiator. It should actually be something that is considered a benchmark. The fundamental objective, I think, should be, subject to a couple of carve-outs and all the rest of it, we should be thinking about households in Australia as solar panels being on the roof, being about as standard as having smoke alarms inside your home. It really doesn't make any sense in a country that's just so profoundly blessed with solar. When it comes to people that live in apartment blocks, it's harder. But there are some really interesting technologies, right? There's solar panels that are foldable that people are deploying on balconies in different parts of the world. There are community battery programs, which I talk about in the book, that would be helpful in those inner areas of cities. But the point being that we need to spread these benefits, distribute these benefits to the rest of the community rather than just certain portions of the community where we've seen huge uptake already.
Just to stay on that point for a moment, because I think it's a really important blind spot that we have at the moment, in that I think the clean energy transition, was assumed that it would be naturally equitable. in that transition. But the reality, as you point out, there are some structural factors that do make that challenging. And some of it is, the big ticket items that we talk about. How do we make big changes to allow landlords to incentivize to put in solar to batteries, etc.? But there's also some just very micro-specific things that we're not doing that we could. So we've been working with a company called Smartizer, which is an Australian company that does basically plug-and-play batteries. So you can stick them on the balcony and you can plug them into your power socket. You don't need electrician, and then when you finish your lease, you can take it with you. Now, these kind of technologies are all permissible across Europe, and they did that partly in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which put a real pressure on the grid and try to find alternative fuel sources. And so for me, it was a great example that if the need is that acute, the policy can move quite quickly. Yet in Australia, both the federal and state regulations, as it stands, we don't allow these kind of things. So for me, it's an example that it's a big issue, this equity issue. And I don't think we've actually looked as hard as we should about what are the things that we can be doing to hardwire equity as much as we can into this clean energy transition.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about transitions are rarely equitable. Any transition is, if you think about it. And in fact, I think a transition, the difference between what is a just transition and what is a transition often relies on your ability to actually identify the people who are most at risk of falling through the cracks of that transition and not overcompensating, but making sure that you are very much leaning in to their particular situation or circumstance and finding a way to meet them with it. I agree with you. There is eminent policy solutions here that would allow this to be much more beneficial to a whole bunch of people, including people in apartment blocks. And in large part, we have too often gone down the pathway, I think, when it comes to a lot of our household energy incentives of targeting what we see as mass rather than what we see as actually where the most acute need is. And that's the difference, I think, when it comes to this sort of stuff.
And maybe that's a good lead into talking about workforce transition, which is one of the most politically charged parts of this. How do you think we should be thinking about it, and what does getting it right look like?
Yeah, I mean, the big picture point I make in the book is, first of all, Australia's got one of the hardest transitions it's going to have to make in terms of its source of prosperity as a country. In 1964, for anyone that knows their history, a guy called Donald Horne wrote that Australia was the lucky country. Now, to anyone who knows their history knows that Horne was actually being ironic. He was saying that that's despite the quality of our political leadership and really a fundamental result of the fact that we have large amounts of resources below our feet, that we're a long way from global hotspots and all the rest of it. The point being that this time, actually, I don't think we can rely on luck alone. We've got to actually be very proactive about this transition. And I say that because if you just look at our trade balance sheet, our largest export is iron ore. Our second and third largest exports are coal and LNG. And if we are to transition those second and third fossil fuel exports into ideally green commodities, that requires us to be very, very proactive. But we probably need to do so because even if you take with a huge grain of salt commitments by 140-something countries around the world, including all of our big customers, including China, that they're going to decarbonize and hit net zero sometime around the middle of the century, it's kind of beholden on us. We're going to be left with a whole bunch of resources and not a lot of customers. And if you look at something like iron ore, it's an opportunity, slightly different one, where in fact we have an opportunity to extract more from that supply chain through actually doing things like producing green iron or even hopefully over time green steel, rather than just shipping the raw commodity overseas for someone else to extract that value. Now, in all of that, I think what we lack in Australia is we kind of have that vision, and we have that vision because of giants like Ross Garnaut in this field, right, who have really spelled out the sort of superpower narrative of what Australia can look like. And his institute, I've done some fantastic work that's shown that even we can extract more value from things like green iron than we ever could from iron ore, right? So we know the kind of vision. What I talk about also in the book, though, is what we don't really have is a vision that makes sense for someone who is in one of the communities that is driving that fossil fuel prosperity in Australia at the moment, right? If you live in a mining community, if you live in one of the industrial port communities, if you work in the coal-fired power sector in Australia, it's very hard for you to feel like that any of this transition is necessarily going to make much sense for you. So again, I think what we've got to be able to do is got to be able to really break it down into feeling like it can give them distinct hope here and now. What I think is some really compelling models are, first of all, in the United States, when they developed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was, as probably all your listeners know, this slightly oddly titled massive piece of climate and energy legislation, the biggest the world's ever seen, by the way, in terms of its impact. But they very deliberately, the Biden administration, targeted particular places and particular communities, which they called fossil fuel legacy communities, right? And what they did was they, for example, designed tax credits that would compound in their value if such projects were being undertaken in those communities. I think we need to be doing the same through things like our Future Made in Australia framework, which is our own version of green industrial strategy. I think that we need to be looking at models like in Spain, where they undertook a series of just transition agreements that made sure that workers felt that they were guaranteed at least the salary and wage that they have now, if not a better one, which is the sort of fundamental, I think, belief that these workers should be able to have if they're to be reskilled and transition themselves into a new workforce. But we can also do all this, by the way, through the fundamental understanding that the great benefit we've got is if you look at the potential, and you both would know this better than me, but if you look at the green industries, so-called of the future in Australia, and where they are best concentrated, they are often best concentrated in exactly the same regions where these fossil fuel legacy communities are. And that's because that we have built a lot of the infrastructure that we will still require. We've built ports, we've built railway lines, and we've obviously got workforces with actually a pretty relevant skill set, albeit with some reskilling required. And that is actually a really good opportunity for us if we can do those transitions right. And part of the sort of litmus test I think that I set in the book has sort of been a sense of whether we're doing this successfully or not. Is if you were to think about a parent in Gladstone or a parent in the Illawarra or a parent in Townsville. A lot of these families feel like hope is just being rapidly drained out of their communities, right? Services are closing, schools are closing, their kids don't see a future for themselves there, let alone their grandkids. I think the moment we actually will feel that we've got this transition right for those communities and for us as a country writ large is not when we look at statistics and all the rest of it, but when those families in those communities actually feel like their children might stay in that community because it's got job prospects, it's got a life in the community and so forth. So I think that's what we've got to get right. But we've got to move from conceptualization and vision making to actual implementation. And we are a long way off that, I fear, as a country.
That's a good segue into talking about Future Made in Australia and what it hopes to achieve. But before we do that, Thom, is there any other policy ideas or things that you cover in the book that you'd like to talk about before we talk about FMIA?
The other big one is just our national resilience. We talk about, in this country, we've almost become numb to the fact that we effectively leap from one disaster to another. And we all get used to the headlines We all get used to the talk of disaster payments, which, by the way, are only $1,000 per adult and about $400 per kid. That's how much the government will give you if your house burns down because of a bushfire or is washed away because of a flood. Um, uh, what we often don't talk about is how do we better avoid that in the first place and respond to it when it does happen. And what really worries me is that as a country, we got 340,000 odd homes that are completely uninsured. We got 500,000 more that are underinsured. And by the way, if you have a mortgage and lose your house and you don't have insurance, the banks, because there is such widespread risk now being carried, they will continue to collect on that mortgage. You're not going to get it wiped out or anything like that. You'll get a couple of months grace. You'll get a year of sort of interest-only payments. But basically, the status quo is that then they'll start collecting on the loan again, which financially ruins people, right? What I think we need to do better is, one, first of all, we need to find a way to solve that insurance crisis. And I think the Californian example from the start of 2025 kind of showed how you can also get it wrong, which is when the state basically takes on all of that risk. I think instead we need to be looking at the government taking on effectively the end of that curve, the risk curve, where the risk is most acute, where insurers won't provide insurance, but doing so in a way that means that it's still those insurers are being compelled to provide that as wide as possible and not simply withdrawing in lieu of the government taking that on. And second of all, I think we need to be able to incentivize not just people doing renewable energy improvements to their home or energy efficiency improvements, but actually doing resilience improvements, right? Too often we have people whose houses do burn down or their houses do get washed away and they just rebuild in the same place. But if, people should be able to be benefiting from similar incentives to clad their house in bushfire resilient protection, to put in place wiring in their house, which is much more flood resistant and so forth. And if they do, there should be some benefit in terms of their insurance premium, obviously, for them doing so. And at the moment, there's very little by way of our system for that. So that's the other really practical kind of discussion that I've tried to get at in the book as well.
Thanks for setting the scene there. It's my takeaway from that first section is that we need to really rethink the narrative and how we're talking about the clean energy transition, and also being wary of our blind spots as we're talking about that. I wanted to switch to talking about green industry policy. So for our international listeners, Australia has something called the Future Made in Australia, the FMIA, and it's the federal government's signature green industry policy, and it covers everything from green metals to critical minerals and low carbon fuels. It's a relatively big deal from an Australian perspective, but it's interesting that in terms of cut through to middle Australia, I don't think it's there. Or in fact, I could go even further and say it's not there. And as evidence point out, our treasurer at the recent budget address didn't really talk about this at all. So it clearly wasn't the thing that they thought is resonating from a middle Australia perspective right now. If you were to sort of tell that Future Made in Australia to the middle Australian story and think about what's the pub test that you would tell this why Future Made in Australia is important to all Australians, what are the kind of things you think we should be talking about with that?
Yeah, it's such a great point. Look, I think that the intent is right. I think that the implementation, we still have a lot to do. And I actually think, last week's budget actually really bore that out, frankly, because I think that at a moment of where we should be profoundly thinking about how we build a more resilient Australia, in many ways, the best thing I think we could have done is put the Future Made in Australia agenda on steroids. And instead, what I think we did was we probably took a little bit of a backward step in some respects. And instead, we focused much more acutely on how do we build resilience in the short term through things like greater fuel supply stocks and so forth. And that was certainly a bit different than I was hoping to see. But I do still hope that in the second half of this year, I think the government's got a really big opportunity to kind of turn a page from the current fossil fuels crisis that we're seeing, and certainly what they must be sensing is a very deep desire on the part of the Australian public to feel like there is much more security of supply, to actually being able to talk about the security of this over the long term, which I think beholdens them having a much greater focus on future made in Australia. I think how do we posit that to Middle Australia? It's got to be about breaking it down, I think, to region, to people and place. Is the point that I talk about in the book, because I think that Future Made in Australia is a profound national story about our transformation, from one source of prosperity effectively to another in a very different world. But actually, it's going to be a very localized story in a lot of parts of Australia, and part of this is also just smart politics, if you ask me, because if you look at a lot of these parts of Australia, they are parts of Australia where they're pretty heavily contested seats, or there's seats often that are actually not held by the Labor Party. So there's actually some really smart politics in being able to market the benefit of Future Made in Australia in a very parochial, very localised way to some of the communities I spoke about before, right? The Illawarra, Gladstone, Townsville, etc. But we need to be able to use that agenda to really be able to paint a picture for what that town, what that region looks like in 10, 15, 20 years. But as I say, also speak here and now to those particular workforces and what we can do right now to help them as part of that transition. So we cannot just do the vision piece. We've got to do the concrete transition piece right now. And I think that would help, because I think that would change the pub conversations, as you put it, Fraser, around Future Made in Australia, which, dare I say it, are probably non-existent at the moment, to actually being one where people would ideally be talking about the fact that government is being proactive in those communities, is seeking to probably do more than a lot of those communities felt has ever been done in their community for quite some time. And would start to, I think, make it real and about their everyday experience in life. So I think that's how we've got to do it. I think the Americans did it relatively well through the Inflation Reduction Act, as I said earlier. Very different economic context than Australia, but I think all of that would help.
With let's take one particular sector, so sustainable aviation fuel. And we at Simon Ventures, we get very excited about sustainable aviation fuel and the potential for Australia. But we are in a kind of a bizarre situation still, where we import over 90% of our fuel. For most types of fuels, we have less than 30 days supply. And you look at our supply chains, incredibly dependent on Middle East sources. So it's a real a huge security risk that we face. And the government has put a cleaner fuels program in. There are incentives to try to think about this. They've announced a demand side mechanism in the recent budget. So all that's promising. Yet I still worry that we haven't really sold this story to Middle Australia about why Australia should have a low carbon fuels industry, and why, given our feedstocks, our proximity to export markets, that this is kind of a no-brainer, that can benefit not only our security, but can create jobs and regional prosperity. I guess, given the framing that you just talked about, how do you think we can better tell that story to get the cut through that we're missing at the moment?
I mean, I think you should never waste a good crisis. And I think that if there's a couple of things that have, I think, really come home to roost in households as a result of this crisis, rather than perhaps in a national discussion, I think first of all is that, despite what we all say, we are inherently a country that is still huge consumers of fossil fuels at a household level, right? There are not enough of us driving EVs. most of us, in fact, are queuing up at the petrol bowser, or were queuing up at the petrol bowser, because now there's more fuels of all variety in this country than there was on the day the crisis began. But I think that has come home to a lot of people. At the same time, though, I think that the penny has dropped with a lot of people. And I think that, one of the things that's really struck me is that Australian households, as they so often are in fact, it feels like ahead of the government in terms of their own resilience planning here. Because households have kind of, we're seeing record EV uptakes, 70,000 sold, I think, in the month of April, which was 40% higher than the previous month before the crisis began. So a lot of households have inherently got to the point of saying, well, yeah, we are inherently reliant on petrol or diesel. We got to get off this, and we've got to find every way off it ourselves. Now, in there's a bit of nuance, which is where I think your opportunity sits, right? Which is there's a middle ground here as well, which is, yes, we're reliant, but this isn't an either-or question. There's also a way just to do this better. And there's a way to do it better, which actually is also inherently economically good for us as a country, has all these flow-on benefits, blah, blah, blah. And that there's some creative messaging work, I think, to be done in to be able to appeal to people, because people will also feel that a lot of the, if you will, post-fuel world is also out of reach for them. And I talk about in the book, for example, how EV policies, we are seeing huge uptake, but again, we're seeing huge uptake largely amongst a pretty well-off set of Australia. EVs are still remarkably inaccessible to most people, or don't necessarily suit their, lifestyle, because they might not live in the city where there's a lot of charging infrastructure and all the rest of it. So there will be a lot of parts of Australia, and particularly a lot of our freight industry, as we've learned perhaps most powerfully during this crisis, that is going to be relying on diesel for a long time, as is a lot of our mining sector, right? As is our aviation sector, to your point around SAF. So, and that's probably, frankly, in the next few months where we're going to probably feel this crisis most acutely, is actually in terms of the supply of jet fuel and the flow-on impact that has both to actual flights, but also flight prices in this country, which are already ridiculously high. But I think that the answer to your question is there's a bit of nuance in the middle there, which is on the one end of the spectrum, if you can, you want to get yourself off this stuff entirely. In the interim, there are better solutions here, and there are solutions which are better for us over the long term, which result in things like SAF and all the other ones that you mentioned.
The other touchy area at the moment is around clean tech supply chains. So if you look across major clean tech supply chains from batteries and solar, China dominates. So China's market share, as you know, is 90% plus in many of the components of batteries and solar. And there have been real efforts, notably in the US, but elsewhere, around trying to diversify and de-risk from China. And this potentially is an opportunity for Australia, that we become the trusted supplier that can develop everything from solar cells through to polysilicon. However, there's real risk, right? That China is so dominant that this could quickly become an anti-China narrative. And you've obviously worked a lot on trade engagement and with China and navigated all these tricky situations. How do you think we should be thinking about our strategy and how we tell that story of that clean tech supply chain diversification?
Yeah, I think we got to not be binary about it, is the point. One of Australia's great strengths, and frankly, the great strength of our economic prosperity at the moment, coupled with our national security environment, is that we have been able to both be a single, a very large economically reliant on China, while at the same time security reliant on the United States. We have not forced ourselves to choose, nor felt that we have had to. And I think it would be a challenge if we went down one particular road there. Now, at the same time, I think you're right. There is absolutely a market opportunity in us being an alternative supplier of a lot of this stuff. Feel that probably most immediately right now with critical minerals, where, we've got, as my old boss used to say, we've got effectively the periodic table when it comes to it. And certainly in terms of what the United States is thirsty for right now, by way of the 53 critical minerals, which they deem really nationally important. I think we've got about 47 of them. We are a profoundly important source of supply for them. And it allows us to develop, I think, industries and technology supply chains for export, where we are able to show that we are a distinct supplier away from the Chinese market, which is important because I think a lot of people that are looking for secure supply chains over the long term will, if they're smart, be looking for multiple sources rather than just one. Now, at the same time, the reason I also say we can't be black and white about that is that will not necessarily make sense in one industry to another. And I'll give you a really good example of that, which is, I spoke earlier about green iron and its potential for Australia. Now, green iron is something where, really the biggest market opportunity exists for Australia is with China, overwhelmingly so. The opportunity with China is larger than the opportunity that would exist with us supplying Korea and Japan combined by quite some distance. Now, that market won't be there forever. China's got alternative options. They've, really, we're talking about a market really in southeastern China as well. But in order for us to really therefore ensure that we can capitalize on that market opportunity with China, we probably, for the security of supply from this, in terms of their interest in getting it from us, we've also got to find a way to probably have them seriously involved in those project developments, right? Now, within the Australian body politic, at the moment, there's probably very little appetite for that, particularly amongst our security apparatus. So we've got to think about things very carefully there with respect to things like Foreign Investment Review Board and all the rest of it. And there'll be a whole bunch of criteria which folks will be considering, proximity of different industries to, whether things are connected to the national grid. They'll be thinking about proximity to defence establishments. They'll be thinking about things like would Chinese joint venture or ownership or credit provision affect potentially our own domestic supply if things were to get troublesome in the world. And on some industries, I think we can actually tick those boxes and say that would be okay. And it's therefore, I think, in our interest to be seeking to do that stuff collaboratively with the Chinese or targeting the Chinese market. On other stuff, I think you're right. There's an opportunity for us to be a distinct alternative supplier to the Chinese. Sometimes that stuff is hard because we will find it hard to compete, particularly on cost with the Chinese, which is why, again, things like Future Made in Australia can be really profound because it needs to be providing a leg up to those industries to allow them to take root.
Great. Right. Last one for me on this is if we think about pulling this all together, but so we've talked about a number of different strands here, the importance of talking about the benefits to regional communities, to over-indexing on those that may be particularly affected in the transition, how we tell this, this kind of nuanced story in terms of engaging with the international partners. I'm giving you the chance for your sort of political stump speech if you were doing the selling the Future Made in Australia version 2.0, Tom, and tell us what are the things that you'd pulled together to tell that story.
Well, I think with Future Made in Australia, at the end of the day, it's one opportunity to get this right as a country. And we really don't, if I look around the state of the Australian national debate, as it's been for a long time, there really isn't an alternative on offer. We're not talking about Australia becoming a professional services hub by the middle of the century. We're not talking about Australia exporting something else. We're not talking about us making, oodles more money than we used to make, for example, through foreign students and education. There's just not a source of prosperity which will replace on our trade balance sheet coal and LNG. So we either really dive into this agenda and get it right and start building it now, because we also know from history that those that actually are proactive in these transitions are often those that are most successful in extracting all of the juice out of the lemon, rather than seeking to play catch up, which is particularly the case in any commercial environment. Or we don't. Like that's the bottom line, you know. And as I said earlier, we can't rely on luck alone. Now, if we're being proactive about it, my point is merely that we need to also be thinking about how do we make sure that we are bringing the Australian people with us in something that's a profound journey and a profound transformation. You know, the last 2 decades have shown that this country is bitterly divided at its worst on climate and energy, and that has held us back from a lot of this stuff as a result. And if we can't get even some of the fundamentals right, how the hell are we going to get the big challenge right? That's the problem. So if we are very deliberate, therefore, about saying, well, let's not have a debate about the merits of climate and energy policy, but let's make sure that we can distribute this transition to as many people as possible, win them over through good policy making rather than politics, then I think over time, we will in fact widen the circle of people who are on this train and all heading in the right direction, rather than simply seeking to do that through argumentation or preaching from on high. And that's my subtle view, I think, of how we can ultimately get there. But we are really in a critical decade, I think, when it comes to whether we can make the big macro transition as a country. And that's why I think it's really important that not only that we carry through the Future Made in Australia agenda, but as I said earlier, we've got to find a way to put it on steroids, because otherwise we really will be profoundly left behind as the rest of the world begins to move on.
And now to start closing off, Thom, we thought it would be helpful to ask you about, you know, what's on your mind at the moment more generally. What are you optimistic about?
You know, we're experiencing an extraordinary disruption to fossil fuels globally right now. And I think that, you know, I think our policy making, as I said earlier, is a bit behind a lot of other countries in how we have dealt with that. I think sometimes in those moments, we also creep into the deepest trenches of parochialism and outdatedness when we talk about things like, you know, building more refineries or drilling for oil again. But what really gives me hope is that I think that for most Australians, they understand that this is a fossil fuels crisis. They understand that it's in their interest to get off fossil fuels as much as they can control. I think that will breed a newfound awareness in this country. I think that the other important part of all of this crisis is not so much just around the fossil fuels versus kind of renewable sources component of this, but it's actually like COVID, underlined the importance of resiliency in terms of your national supply chains, your ability to stand on your own 2 feet, how you make your sources of money, what can happen if supply chains are disrupted. And all of that is also, when you overlay that with the other point, it all speaks to the need to be able to develop the kind of new industries that both of you are so deeply involved in and promoting. Again, because we just don't have any other alternatives. So I think that that's given me a lot of hope. People are, you know, I think in politics you can sometimes not give enough credit to how smart the electorate is. And I think that Australian households have really shown in this crisis through their own habits that they are, in fact, I think, out in front of a lot of the body politic on this.
Very good. I think that's a nice point on which to close. And Thom, look, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. And for our listeners, the book that Thom has written is called Power, Prosperity and Planet, Climate and Energy Policy for All. And it's out now through Monash University Publishing. And I have to say, I read it, really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it too because it was brief and to the point. Often these days we find that the book sizes are getting bigger and bigger. So I thought there's something very nice, Thom, about getting to the point in a very concise way. So well done on your book, and we wish you all the best with that, and more importantly, getting this message that you're so passionate about into the public domain.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you both.
So that was a great chat with Thom. Fraser, did this conversation change how you're thinking about communicating what Cyan Ventures does and what others do in this industry that we're so focused on?
Yeah, I thought it was really good. And I think the point that Thom makes is that we need to get a lot better and give a lot more focus to how we're communicating things. I think sometimes we spend much time in designing the policy, designing the thoughts, and we kind of assume that will be enough. And the reality is, as Thom mentioned, transitions are messy. And there'll be winners, there'll be losers. But how we think about really thoughtfully about, not just, I guess, the communications, but who are the ones that are going to be most affected? How do we find ways that go above and beyond to make sure that we turn them from potential critics to, our greatest cheerleaders? I think is really important. And I think the way we tell the story has to evolve. And just hearing the way that Thom was telling the story of from everything from solar to low carbon fuels, there's some similarities, but also some key differences from what we're hearing from the politicians at the moment. And I think that's an important difference.
Yeah, I mean, like with any project and any transition and anything we work on, from a strategic perspective, remembering that there's real people at the end of the day that are affected and considering them in all decision making. And one big question for us to mull over is the clean energy sector's biggest problem demand and finance, like we talked about in our first episode, or is it actually just a communications problem and everything else leads on from there?
Well, I wish it was just a communications problem, but I think it's all of the above, unfortunately. But it's we talk a lot about demand and finance because those are the things that will really unblock these projects. Mm-hmm. But we need the communications to go alongside that, because that gives us, the if you like, the political coverage, the support to actually make those big changes that we need in demand and finance to get these projects over the line. And the way I like to think about it is kind of an insurance policy too, because we know with any kind of industrial transformation, things will go wrong. We don't know exactly what it will be yet, but we know that from history that things will go wrong. There'll be, companies that go under, projects that just don't make it. And the key then will be, what's the reaction? Do we have enough real goodwill in the community because people see the benefits, it's been explained to them clearly, that they understand that, look, there'll always be hiccups in the journey, but we carry on. We've got a very clear direction. Or have we not embedded that strongly enough? And this really derails the whole transition. I thought one of Thom's closing points was really important here when he said that to paraphrase what he said, we talk about future made in Australia. It really is the only future made in Australia. We don't have anything of the scale to replace our existing export industry without a credible green industrial strategy. Mm-hmm. And I think talking about that urgency and how it matters for everyone, I think that becomes a really key part of the narrative. And I think we need to do better to establish that.
Before we sign off, what are you focusing on right now? What are you watching over the next week or two? What's piquing your interest in the transition landscape right now?
So I'm intrigued by a number of things at the moment. One is that in the recent budget announcement, there was, for low carbon fuels, there was an announcement of a demand mechanism. So the headline was there. We don't yet have the meat. And so we're waiting for the next stage of the industry consultation, where hopefully we'll hear a bit more about the government thinking and how to make that happen. And I think it's a really crucial piece because, as we talked about in our first podcast, without that demand side mechanism, it's very hard to get a lot of these first of kind sectors really off to the racetrack. So getting that demand side mechanism and developing it really thoughtfully is key. So there's a number of things coming up, but that's probably the one that I'm with most anticipation looking forward to.
Keeping you up at night.
Exactly.
Similarly, I'm exploring the recently announced budget's VC incentives and what that means for climate investing. And also the Responsible Investment Association Australasia. The conference is happening this week in Melbourne. So I'm looking forward to following along and seeing what comes out of that. There's a session on blended finance, which I'm particularly interested in. So we'll be keeping an eye on how that progresses. And that's it for this episode of Before It Scales. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and sign up to our newsletter at cyanventures.com.au for episode clips and show notes. We'll add a link to that in our show notes and in our description. We'll see you soon. Before It Scales.